Okay, so the three origin types of work that we're going to be discussing this week include parables. And I am pretty sure that most of you all will be familiar with a parable um, once we start talking about it. But a parable, by definition, is a figure of speech which presents a short story, typically with a moral lesson at the end. You've often heard stories from your elders, like the boy who cried wolf, and all is vanity, and these are parables because they teach you a certain moral lesson. It comes from the Greek word parable, which means comparison, and basically a parable is a succinct narrative or universal truth that uses symbolism, simile, and metaphor to demonstrate a lesson that is intended to be taught. It's kind of like an analogy, um, and we find most commonly parables in religious texts like the Quran or the Bible. And I just want to talk really quickly about the function of a parable. It's a great teaching tool. The function of a parable is to teach something. And the reason I say that it's a great teaching tool is because it uses this symbolic imagery or metaphor that is easily recognized or accessible to an audience. And the storyteller can then convey something complicated like a moral truth in a way that's more relatable or understandable or accessible in one's own life. And sometimes the listener has to discern the lesson that a parable conveys, and the audience has to participate in arriving at the conclusion in some sort of way. And essentially, parables help readers understand philosophical issues or moral lessons in terms that we can apply in our daily lives. And the most common type of parable, or where we see them most prevalent and where you're probably familiar with them, are biblical parables. And they are the most recognizable and universally known. And these parables are part of a larger narrative of the Bible, specifically in the gospel when we get to the teachings of Jesus. But many are self contained stories that convey cultural beliefs and explain human life. Some common ones are the parable of the prodigal son, the hidden treasure, all sorts of I mean, the Bible is full of these biblical parables. And the one that I have picked for us to read is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I mentioned last week that we were going to be reading two, but for the sake of time, and I want to make sure that we can cover the material fully. I have I've decided to not have you read the parable of the sower unless you want to. It's really short and quick, but the one that we'll be discussing fully is the parable of the Good Samaritan. In addition to our parable, we are going to discuss creation stories and myths. And creation stories and myths are really interesting because all societies, all cultures, all walks of life have their own. Most of them, many of them are quite fascinating. But if we want to look at a definition or how to categorize what these myths or creation stories are, they're narratives about the origin of the world and of humans. They tell of commonly held beliefs about pretty much anything, in order to kind of believe in these stories. We don't have to be dependent upon factual proof in order to believe them. We just do, right? Out of faith or whatever. But these myths or creation stories also embody the values and beliefs of a culture. So if you look at Native American creation stories, which we will, they embody the values of a particular tribe or group. If you look at African creation stories, they embody the values of a particular group. If you look at religious creation stories, like the creation story in the Bible of Genesis, they all help us kind of piece together a sort of social and cultural identity. And the goal of these myths is really to explain two things: nature. Where does the earth come from? Where do the heavens come from? Why do we have seasons? The geography. Any question that man might have, these creation myths or these creation stories attempt to answer that in a way that we'll accept. They also answer or attempt to explain where man comes from and how did we come into being. A lot of these myths have stark contrasts among their characters, and they also embody mythical or religious qualities with a focus on heroic or villainous individuals. There's got to be good and bad to kind of balance out that duality. There's some sort of conflict with no compromise between two people. They are not fully developed characters, but rather stock, flat characters. But these myths also kind of occupy an isolation between time and space, which we'll talk about. The creation stories and myths that we are going to be reading are the story of Bat and Sun from the Biba people of Cameroon. And the Biba people, I think I'm saying that right, are agrarian or farmers from people in Central Africa. And the main kind of focus on Bat and Sun embodies several values, including friendship, family, and death, which we'll talk about when we come together to talk about Bat and Sun. We're also going to be looking at Demeter and Persephone, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but this is a Greek myth that explains the changing of the seasons. Why do we have seasons? How did they come to be? And some of the other things that it addresses is this concept of love, of motherhood, and coming of age, of growing up. So we'll talk about those things as well. And then finally, we will be talking about Moon and Morning Star, which comes from, it's a creation story from the Wichita people of southern Oklahoma. And essentially it answers the question where the earth comes from. So keep these in mind as you go through the readings for this week. They're not too terribly long. And when we come together to discuss, have some questions in mind. I'm going to put some things for you to consider for us when we come together to talk. But that's it for me for now. And I look forward to seeing what you guys think of our parables and our creation myths and stories, and how you think that these kind of how these stories can be used as teaching tools. So having said that, happy reading, and I can't wait to hear what you guys think.